So for my research, the broad goal that I'm trying to achieve with a couple of different projects is to develop new methods to access the lives of non-royal people in ancient Egypt and challenge some assumptions about ancient society that come largely from modern values and concepts. Most of my approaches are based in particular on accessing the actions, knowledge, and lives of carpenters by studying the construction of ancient Egyptian wooden coffins. So to help you understand a bit more, let's take a look at how we as Egyptologists have viewed Egyptian society and the role of craftspeople within it. So the traditional and rather out-of-date view of ancient Egyptian society is based on this concept of the social pyramid. Now, this image is still used today in textbooks as a means to simplify social discussions. The pyramid shows the major professional ranks in ancient Egypt, arranged both hierarchically and to reflect the population numbers that belong to each level. So at the top sits the pharaoh, and just below him are the government officials, nobles, and priests. And then on the bottom are the farmers and slaves, and just above them are craftsmen. Now, this notion of society is not simply a modern creation, but was also reflected in ancient Egyptian tomb scenes, wall paintings that decorated the tombs of the elite. Here we see the elite tomb owner on the left, sitting on a chair overseeing teams of nameless, low-ranking craftsmen who labored to produce the rich goods that this high-ranking nobleman will use in the afterlife. Now, for the early decades of Egyptology, scholars believed that these scenes reflected the social realities of daily life in ancient Egypt. About 50 years or so ago, we came to realize that this is an overly idealized version of the life that the tomb owner hopes to achieve after death and live on in the afterlife. So here he will spend each day dressed in fine white linens, where he's served by hosts of doting servants who will grow, craft, and cook everything he or she could possibly want. But as the depicted tomb owners were usually depicted all in the same way, well, no matter what profession they actually held, and some of them were actually high-ranking craftsmen, it's now much more obvious that society is more complicated than these types of images once made it seem. Nevertheless, despite the constant emphasis from many scholars that these are not realistic scenes of daily life, this pyramidal view of society continues to dominate introductory discussions of the field. Now, Egyptologists are, for the most part, pretty smart people. Scholarship has come a long way from this, and very few scholars view this as a realistic image of Egyptian society, or at least they acknowledge that it's overly simplistic. But even with this acknowledgement, these ideas of a rigid society continue to creep into scholarship. This idea has created what I believe to be unconscious biases about the abilities and knowledge of the individuals most closely associated with the lower levels of this representation. So for instance, once an individual is understood to be a craftsperson, some Egyptologists seem to have difficulty understanding that they could also be literate and therefore be seen as scribes in some contexts, and could also be high-ranking nobles. There also seems to be this idea that they lacked significant agency, that they were constantly dependent on the patronage and protection of this hierarchical system, adapting only when the elite told them to and in ways that the elite decided. By studying the work of carpenters through Coffins, I hope to demonstrate just how fluid some of these divisions were and to complicate our view of these multifaceted individuals. Challenging these assumptions about ancient individuals helps to adjust our understanding of the history of technology, of craftsmanship, and of course, the human capacity to adapt, imagine, and create more generally, which is why this is so important. And so now let's see how coffins are helping to provide us these insights. So Egyptian coffins seem to have always fascinated the public and Egyptologists, who generally realize that they are potent, complicated objects. To begin to understand them, you have to know a little bit about ancient Egyptian religion. Now, the ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife in which you were able to live an idealized version of your life on Earth, as we already discussed. But you weren't automatically guaranteed entry into this perfect eternity after death. First, you had to transform yourself into an effective spirit called an ach. Only the ach was able to pass the many tests required to make it to the afterlife. For this transformation, you had to combine 5 very important elements of your spirit or identity, one of which was the body with its intact heart. Through a series of rituals, the body was able to contain all the other necessary elements and keep them together for eternity, permitting the transformation into an ach. If the body was not intact, the deceased might therefore never become an ach, which meant they would not be permitted entrance to the afterlife. Preserving the body and ensuring its continued protection was therefore one of the most important aspects of funerary religion. While mummification first preserved the body, the coffin was needed to physically protect the corpse and provide a barrier against possible threats such as robbing or desecration by insects and pests. But that's not all. The coffin was also meant to provide magical protection, helping to keep those elements of the spirit together and provide assistance for the ach to pass all the additional trials that stood between them and their perfect afterlife. The coffin was therefore considered a fundamental element of the burial throughout Egyptian history. It never lost this protective quality. However, the means by which it protected the deceased did change through time. Some of the earliest datable coffins come from around 3200 BCE, and they remained in continuous use through to the end of pharaonic civilization into the Greco-Roman period and beyond. So this means that there is continuous use of wooden coffins in ancient Egypt for almost 4,000 years. Now, over this immense span of time, religious beliefs, of course, changed and adapted, and with them, so did the significance and shape of the coffin, as well as the different rituals needed to magically activate it and prepare it to protect the deceased. From the earliest iterations through to the end of the Old Kingdom around 2200 BCE, the coffin was built as a rectangular, eternal dwelling of the deceased. And at this point, it was not usually painted or inscribed, so it looks like this one up here on the left. From the end of the Old Kingdom through to the end of the Middle Kingdom, so from about 2200 to 1650 BCE, colorful decoration became more regular, and the Egyptians started to inscribe protective spells on the interior of the coffins, which Egyptologists somewhat uncreatively call coffin texts. And you can see those in the columns on this coffin here. In addition to remaining an eternal dwelling, the spells increasingly called to the god Osiris, the god of the underworld, to help the dead reach the afterlife. By the New Kingdom, around 1550 BCE, the Osirid elements had taken priority, and the coffin was now usually constructed in an anthropoid or human-shaped form. This form was meant to reflect the deceased magically transformed into the god Osiris, and it could actually serve as a backup body if something happened to the corpse. Now, the spells that decorated the coffin changed slightly and consisted of a new corpus of spells that the Egyptians referred to as the spells for coming forth by day, but which are more popularly known today as the Book of the Dead. Now, despite these general trends, there is always a rather significant range in quality and cost of coffins throughout all these periods. The lowest ranking members of Egyptian society could not afford coffins. They were usually put into desert pits with a few belongings or could have been wrapped up in reed mats. But a lower middle ranking individual might have been able to afford a rather humble wooden coffin, such as the type found here. And in all periods, a number of undecorated plain wooden coffins have been found. On the other hand, the highest members of Egyptian society, the pharaohs, were also buried in wooden coffins, often multiple nested sets decorated with gold and precious materials, and then they were also placed in stone sarcophagi. So, in this very brief, hopefully, overview of Egyptian coffins, you can hopefully better understand their place and function in Egyptian society. These were complicated, religiously potent objects that could cost a small or large fortune. They were found in all periods of ancient Egypt, in all regions of the country, and their owners represent a fairly broad spectrum of Egyptian society. And it's because of the ubiquity of Egyptian wooden coffins, and because, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of direct evidence for things like woodworking workshops, that I decided to study Egyptian wooden coffins to see what they might reveal about the development of woodworking techniques and workshop organization, and perhaps tell us about the people who constructed them. But this process has not been particularly easy. While coffin studies is actually a very popular subdiscipline of Egyptology, traditionally this has meant an examination of the coffin decoration and the translation of the texts that were painted alongside the complicated imagery. In fact, publications often only include images of these decorations or even just transliterations of the texts. Many of the older publications don't even show images of the whole coffin. Until very recently, undecorated coffins were almost completely ignored, to the extent that some heartbreaking early excavation reports describe piling these pieces up and burning them in bonfires at excavation parties. Now, I'm interested in a more holistic view of the coffin, what we can learn about Egyptian society by combining the information that we have about coffin decoration with an analysis of the materials and techniques used in construction, and the data we can still recover related to the fine context of these objects. Beyond studying coffin decoration and translating hieroglyphs, this has meant working alongside carpenters in Cairo and Los Angeles, learning woodworking techniques myself to better understand the construction process, and studying wood species identification through anatomical examination using various methods in microscopy. For both the actual study of the construction practices and the wood identifications, I had to, of course, also gain access to a whole bunch of ancient Egyptian coffins. And for that, I have a number of museum curators and excavators to thank, which I'll do so at the end of my talk. But it's only thanks to the incredible access that I've been permitted that I've been able to study coffins in detail and gain some really amazing insights into the non-royal world of ancient Egypt. Now, as I noted, to help provide some examples of these insights, I've chosen 2 snapshots of my recent research projects to share with you, which both discuss coffins in the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Now, in my last bit of background, I'm going to explain the elite and political history of these periods very briefly, so that we can then compare this more official history to the history of practice expressed through coffin construction. So the Old Kingdom, the Pyramid Age, lasted from about 2670 to 2170 BCE, and it includes Egyptian dynasties 3 through 8. Dynasties 3, 4, and 5, all very stable. The 4th dynasty kings are the ones who built the Great Pyramids of Giza. These kings seem to have had pretty much complete control over the population. They were seen as semi-divine rulers and the ultimate intermediary between the people and the gods. And at this point, the wealthy were basically doing everything in their power to keep the king happy. It was only with the king's blessing that somebody could be guaranteed that idyllic, elite afterlife that people painted in their tombs. If you were granted a tomb near the king, you were particularly blessed. And this is why the plateau at Giza doesn't just have the monumental pyramids. It also has fields of smaller tombs provided directly through royal proclamation for the king's favored followers. In the 5th dynasty, however, we start to see positions being given to loyal nobles who are, for a change, not part of the king's family. These figures acted like mayors of different provinces in ancient Egypt, and these individuals began to choose to be buried in their home province instead of at the capital. Large provincial cemeteries started to arise around these noble burials, which were usually equipped from the noble's own private wealth, not through the assistance of the king. At this point, for a number of additional reasons, the king's power started to diminish. Not only was power moving out to the provinces, but there seems to have been a few droughts, and then after the death of Pepi II, the final king of the 6th dynasty, the state was in a steady period of decline. Egypt's infrastructure was crumbling, the international trade routes start to break down, and then after Dynasty 8, the political rule of Egypt collapses. Power was now divided between kings in the north and the south, and then those provincial mayors start to be seen as leaders in their own right. This time is what Egyptologists refer to as the First Intermediate Period, and in the Egyptian literary tradition, it's seen as a time of complete chaos. This quote comes from a tale called The Admonitions of Ipuwer, and it was written after Egypt's reunification and was originally believed to describe what was happening during the First Intermediate Period. And so it states, "The Egyptians are engaged in warfare, and the whole country is up in arms. The wrongdoer is everywhere. No craftsmen work. The enemies of the land have spoiled its crafts. No offices are in their place, like a roaming herd without a herdsman." Now, when Egyptologists first found these passages, they took them largely at their word. The First Intermediate Period was seen as a dark age when craft production all but halted and everybody was just killing each other. And this period lasted for over 100 years. And indeed, there are a lot of examples of, let's say, awkward art from this period, like what you can see in the background of this image here. Trade routes do also shift, making it more difficult to acquire certain goods, and there was war. But we're starting to come around to the idea that perhaps the subsequent elites were being a little bit dramatic. Maybe the First Intermediate Period was a time of social reorganization and experimentation. Some new styles of art, pottery forms, and tomb architecture also emerged during this period that will have a lasting impact on Egypt, its art, and its history. But eventually, one powerful dynasty did manage to defeat all others and reunite Egypt, which started the Middle Kingdom, another period of stability and prosperity for Egypt. So that's the official history of the early Old Kingdom, the late Old Kingdom, the First Intermediate Period, and the Middle Kingdom. Whew. So let's see what the history of coffin construction during these periods tells us about the non-royal craftspeople and their experiences during this time. So our first snapshot is about community resiliency. And we're going to start discussing this by taking a look at coffins in the early Old Kingdom, from dynasties 3 to 5. These are the coffins that are largely undecorated and built to reflect elements of elite estates and the eternal home of the deceased. They can be more elaborate, like this version on the left, which shows elements of the exterior walls of elite estates. It's a little bit hard to understand if you're not an Egyptologist, but I promise. And some of them are simpler in form, like this one on the right. They come from a number of different sites, and at this point they're fairly common, but coffins in general occur in much smaller numbers than in the later periods at this point. Some elite versions are made of imported materials, and they're found in tombs near the capital. And the wealthiest at this point also often had stone sarcophagi. Frequently, all of this was given to them directly by the king. The king himself does not seem to have had a wooden coffin at this point, just stone sarcophagi. The construction techniques used to create wooden coffins in this period varied considerably. So these are some of the different joint types used frequently in ancient Egypt. In the early Old Kingdom, some coffins were made very simply using what's referred to as a butt joint, where the piece is just a butt. Others had lap joints or half lap joints, where a shoulder was cut into one or both of the corner pieces being connected. Some were connected using miter joints, some with a shouldered miter, some with a miter surmounted with a butt joint or surmounted with half dovetail joints, joined with mortise and tenon joints or dowels or ties. And you could even find a combination of these different joints at each corner of some of the coffins. So basically what's important to note is that there's a lot of ways to make a wooden box, and in the early Old Kingdom, the Egyptian carpenters were using them all. Starting at the end of the 5th dynasty, but particularly in the 6th, and this is the time when more individuals were moving out to the provinces, the numbers of wooden coffins increase dramatically, more than we can suggest is related to a survival issue. And we believe that the final king of the 5th dynasty, King Unas, may have also had a wooden coffin placed within his stone sarcophagus. The decoration of the coffin changes and becomes standardized. Coffins are now generally decorated with a formulaic inscription around the exterior and a pair of what are referred to as wadjet eyes placed at the end of the coffin. Wadjet eyes are protective symbols that were placed in front of where the face of the deceased would have been positioned inside the coffin, and it allowed the inhabitant to look out from the beyond and receive offerings from his or her successors. What is more remarkable for our purposes, however, is that somewhat suddenly coffin construction practices also became standardized. So no matter where the coffin is, in the provinces or the capital, made out of imported wood or local, for the elite or the middle class, the vast majority of wooden coffins are now connected at the corners with a miter joint surmounted with a butt joint. Now, as we've discussed, there are a lot of ways to make a box, and this approach is not the easiest nor the strongest. So what does this mean? For this approach to have taken over at all sites, I believe that carpenters had to have originally belonged to the same crafting community. I think that as the elite started to gain some independence from the king, the demand for wooden coffins rose dramatically. Wooden coffins made of imported woods are considered very prestigious, but they are much more accessible than stone sarcophagi, which usually required royal intervention to obtain. Where before there is no standardization, it is likely that there was also not such a thing as a professional coffin maker. It's likely that carpenters were creating coffins in whatever method they desired alongside other woodworking projects. With the increase in demand and a move to standardized decorative forms, full-time coffin carpenters, or carpenters who at least specialized in coffins, may have emerged. They seem to start first in the capital, but then they move to the provinces to create the elite coffins for the mayors. Once there, they also created less expensive examples for the rest of the local population, building up those provincial cemeteries. As they trained their successors, they taught them the standard forms of construction, and coffin making became a specialized business. But the story doesn't end there. Despite the literary suggestion that all craft ended in the first intermediate period, wooden coffins continued to be created throughout this era. And while the numbers are lower than in the previous period, some of them represent some pretty fine examples, as we'll see later on in this talk. While there are some small variations and developments in the decoration, the standard construction method remains. After the first intermediate period, when Egypt is reunited, wooden coffin numbers boom once again, and throughout this period, the standard coffin construction method remains. This is despite a number of different changes to the decoration and regional variations in decoration. Occasionally, we do see much higher elite examples adding a half lap to connect the base to the sides, but even for these, the coffin corners continue to follow the standard form. This construction technique does not change until the anthropoid coffin takes over as the most popular form, at the very end of the Middle Kingdom around 1700 BCE. Now, interestingly, while rectangular coffins are still seen after this shift, they are now rare, usually lower quality, and are almost all constructed using dovetail joints. This therefore demonstrates another major shift in training and construction practices, but we're not going to go that far today. So from the snapshot, we can see how an assessment of coffin construction practices alongside those other major social, political, and religious developments helps us to see how carpenters were adapting to the changing needs of an elite and sub-elite community. The emergence of a standard construction technique suggests a democratization of afterlife practices, meaning that wooden coffins become much more prevalent among a greater proportion of society, both in terms of class and regional distribution. The increase in demand seems to have allowed a professional community of coffin carpenters to emerge. They developed a system for creating coffins, probably first in the capital, and then moved out to the provinces following the spread of elite mayors and the establishment of large provincial cemeteries. The continuation of the same coffin construction tradition, moving into the first intermediate period, demonstrates the resiliency of coffin carpenter communities. Despite the breakdown of political structures and social hierarchies, and the emergence of other artistic and production techniques, the coffin carpenters simply adapted to a smaller variety of materials and perhaps a different assortment of clientele. This means that they were not dependent on royal patronage. This also demonstrates a continuation in Egyptian funerary beliefs and practices throughout what is seemingly a chaotic period. After unification, these communities continue on with their tradition, adapting once again to the new demand and an increase of imported woods. These communities clearly passed down their traditions to their successors, who continued to use the same techniques, So that from roughly 2400 to 1700 BCE, for about 700 years, coffins were made in almost exactly the same way. This says a lot about the communities of people who are referenced so infrequently in formal texts. But let's see what another snapshot can tell us. So now I want to move from a look at the importance of construction techniques to the importance of timber selection. And for this, I'll discuss the use of cedar and cedar skeuomorphs to create wooden coffins from the Old to Middle Kingdoms. Now, to start off with, what is a skeuomorph? In Catherine Freeman's discussion of the practice, she notes this skeuomorph refers to the meaningful imitation in one material of forms or shapes common to another. Now, we see this pretty frequently in ancient cultures and actually in our own cultures too. In Mari at the Palace of Zimri Lim, brick and limestone plinths were decorated to imitate expensive marble. In Minoan Greece, clay vessels were decorated to resemble elite silver vessels, complete with representations in clay of the metal rivets, which of course had no functional purpose in the clay skeuomorph. My cheap aluminum deck furniture is built to imitate finely crafted wooden masterpieces. But while the creation of skeuomorphs could have several functions, the most common use of skeuomorphs appears to be an attempt to elevate a less expensive material to an elite material through a manipulation of its form and decoration. So for our purposes, it refers to decorating coffins made out of less prestigious local woods so that they looked like coffins made out of imported cedar wood. But before we can look at skeuomorphs, we should take a look at the significance of cedar and what it meant to the Egyptians when used to construct a coffin. First of all, cedar did not grow locally in Egypt. Local Egyptian trees did actually grow more plentifully in the ancient environment than today, and some of them did actually produce good, close-grained timber. But Egyptian trees did not grow particularly tall, wide, or straight. This often meant that the wooden objects were crafted from really oddly shaped or curved planks that were then joined together through some rather ingenious means. In addition, the local trees contained few extractives. That's the oils or resins that cause timber to be aromatic or insect resistant. In nearby West Asia, there were a number of softwood evergreen tree species that grew very tall and straight, were resinous, smelled wonderful, and looked wonderful. And many of these species, pines, firs, and junipers, would have served as superior construction timber to the local Egyptian varieties. And I do want to note that in Egyptological discussions, it is often stated that Egypt was importing a variety of woods. And if a clearly high-quality timber is used for coffin construction, but no wood anatomist has yet identified it, the scholar will often say something like, this is made from an imported wood such as fir, pine, or cedar. But this casual remark belies a misunderstanding of both the value of wood in the ancient world and the significance of cedar specifically. For it was the Lebanese cedar, Cedrus libani, that was overwhelmingly chosen to be imported into Egypt, particularly for coffin construction. Now, this tree did grow very tall, up to 40 meters, and produced straight, very fragrant, insect-resistant wood. Now, depending on how old the wood was and where in the tree it came from, it would produce timber that was yellow to red in color. Sometimes, as we see in these three images here, sort of red and yellow streaks. The preference for cedar for elite coffins has been demonstrated repeatedly in recent studies of wooden coffins that have been identified by wood specialists. For instance, in a study of 69 Middle Kingdom wooden coffins by Maria Victoria Asencia Moros from the Louvre, 35 of them were constructed from imported woods. 31 of those 35 were identified as cedar, while 2 were cypress and 2 were yew. Other studies by Caroline Cartwright and my own analyses have arrived at similar results. So again, we know that for some reasons, the Egyptians wanted cedar the most. Now, it's possible that the great height of cedar, the color of the wood, or the fragrance made cedar stand out. But whatever of these reasons, the preference and value of cedar timber seems to have originated closer to its place of origin in West Asia, where we hear about Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians selecting the timber as a building material for palaces and temples, emphasizing its elite and royal qualities, and it also had a particular religious significance. For instance, in one of the most famous epics from West Asia, the Epic of Gilgamesh, cedars come up a few times. Gilgamesh and Enkidu stood marveling at the forest, observing the height of the cedar. They were gazing at the cedar land, the dwelling of the gods, the throne of the goddesses. Now, this emphasis on cedar for elite, royal, and religious purposes in West Asia seems to have been part of what Sherratt and Sherratt referred to as an international material language of ostentation and display. And it's the desire to participate in this system of elite values that was almost certainly a major factor in Egypt's decision to import cedars over other similar timbers. Now, once it arrived in Egypt, it quickly acquired local values and significance. Textual references associate cedar with royal and elite constructions, particularly for coffins, funerary boats, monumental doors, and flagposts. Now, this makes it clear that prestigious imported cedarwood was associated with the elite and royalty. From a religious perspective, cedar, particularly once again in the context of coffins, became closely associated with both the solar gods and the funerary god, Osiris. While these references can be found from early on, one of the clearest explanations dates the 21st dynasty, the 11th century BCE, in a variant of the Book of the Dead spell, 193. In this spell, we are told, as for one who has a coffin of cedar, he enters shrines like a god. He is alive among those who do not perish, truly. Now, the religious references make it clear that in addition to an imported prestigious timber, cedar was also seen as a potent material that could protect the solar god and the god of the dead, Osiris, and then through its use for the coffin, as noted here, assist the deceased with their journey to the afterlife, where they would be among those who do not perish. Shifting to the cedar coffins themselves, we can see that the use of cedar was therefore emphasized visually. From the 5th dynasty to the beginning of the 13th, from about 2400 to 1700 BCE, the highest ranking elite were buried in rectangular cedar coffins. The exterior of the coffin was usually left largely bare, with the exception of a pair of wadjet eyes and a formulaic offering inscription. Leaving the wood bare ensured that the elaborate cedar wood figure, with its contrasting reds and yellows, would be visible. The fact that these are thick, large, straight pieces of wood could also be seen, which was generally not possible with local timbers. To anybody who saw these coffins, they would therefore understand that its owner, Jehutinacht, a wealthy mayor, had access to this prestigious timber and would have a particularly effective coffin, which would help them reach the afterlife. Jehutinacht and his wife actually had multiple cedar coffins, in addition to other elaborate burial goods. Looking to the interior of Jehutinacht's coffin, it was covered with decorations and spells, further emphasizing his religious knowledge and his desire to have all the possible elements of protection on his journey to paradise. Now, one aspect of this decoration is particularly interesting. This is the false door. Now, the false door was an elaboration of the wadjet eye motif, which allowed the deceased to move in between the land of the living and the dead to receive offerings from those left on earth. This set of doors has been painted with a very elaborate wood grain pattern, which hopefully you can see on your screens. The pattern is illustrated in a way to emphasize that these doors were made from large, high-quality pieces of timber. The species of wood cannot be ascertained from the pattern. However, in order to create large straight doors from a single piece of wood, imported wood would have had to be used. Given that the wealthy Jehutinacht ensured that he and his wife would have multiple coffins of thick cedar wood for their burial, it seems likely that he also desired to emphasize that the doors he used to move between life and death would also have been made of the most religiously potent timber, cedar. We therefore seem to have an instance of cedar grain painted on cedar wood. And in fact, in other elite cedar coffins, these doors are left undecorated, in these cases allowing the cedar wood itself to emphasize the materiality of the doors. While the majority of the cedar coffins were left undecorated, some had more decoration, which tended to get more complicated as you go on throughout the Middle Kingdom. In these cases, a wash of yellow or red paint was sometimes applied over the exterior of the coffin, just like this coffin of the overseer of the house and chief physician, Sen. In these cases, however, the paint was applied directly to the cedar wood, rather than on a plaster preparation layer as was otherwise common on decorated coffins made from local woods. This ensured that the paint would act more like a stain, and the cedar grain would still be visible. Yellow and red both have protective qualities associated with the solar gods and protection, qualities also associated with cedar. And it's possible that the owners chose to enhance these properties by adding this colored wash, while still ensuring that their ability to obtain cedar wood and their understanding of its prestigious and religious significance would have been apparent. They may have even understood that the brighter natural hues of the wood would fade over time, and by adding the stain, they would be able to ensure that these powers remained intact. Because cedar was such a potent and prestigious material, everybody wanted it. But not everybody could afford it. Craftspeople working for individuals who could not access the large amounts of cedar timber necessary to construct a full cedar coffin still found ways to integrate it. This would demonstrate knowledge of elite fashions and religious practice shared by the craftsperson and their patron. In a few cases, they did this by adding a very thin cedar veneer to a local wood core. This was not a particularly common practice, and in fact, I've only been able to find 4 veneered coffins. This one, the coffin of the Mayor Pepi Seneb, dates to the First Intermediate Period, around 2150 BCE, and has a core of local acacia wood under the cedar veneer. We know that it became much more difficult to acquire large pieces of cedar during the First Intermediate Period, when the direct sea trading routes seem to have been out of use. It is possible that smaller amounts could still have been obtained through different trade routes, or the strips of cedar may have been reused from earlier cedar coffins. Nevertheless, the creation of this piece demonstrates the continued high value placed on cedar even during these somewhat less affluent periods, and the desire of the elite mayor to demonstrate his ability to participate in this practice, even if on a lesser scale than his predecessors. It also shows the continued skills of the carpenters who adapted to their patrons' desires. And of course, even in this piece, the core of the coffin was made using the miter joint surmounted by a butt joint. For the majority of the ancient Egyptians, however, even these small amounts of cedar wood would have been out of reach. In these cases, the Egyptians relied on the power of imagery, which was very potent in Egyptian belief systems. A local wood coffin was constructed, which was then decorated to look like cedar. In the more elaborate versions of this practice, which are actually fairly common, the local wood coffin was covered with a base layer of plaster, then painted over with a yellow background, and decorated with red lines imitating an elaborate wood grain pattern. Let's see if I can, There, that's easier. This is the coffin of the royal ornament, a woman named Kepshet or Janam, which was made out of sycamore fig wood and then decorated. There is no attempt to make the wood grain pattern appear realistic, like what we saw with Jehudinacht. Instead, the decoration takes on a more artistic geometric pattern. The artist has, however, added in a few key details. Now, the actual local timbers used to create this coffin are not straight. They are rather wobbly and have been joined together to create what looks like a straight side. However, the pattern painted on here makes it look like this is one large piece of wood. And this is particularly apparent on the lid. Let's see here, where the end grain has made it appear like this is all cut from one big trunk of a thick piece of wood, when in actual fact, this lid was made from 4 separate planks of wood. Now, let's see if I can zoom out again here. There we go. Now, it's also likely significant that the painter chose yellow and red, the protective colors associated with cedarwood. While Kepshet was not as high-ranking as the owners of the cedar coffins discussed today, she was still a titled individual and should be considered a member of the lower elite. The integration of the decorative details suggests that the creators were either familiar with patterns found in high-quality timbers, and so knew what they should look like, or they were familiar with high-quality elite coffins and mimicked the patterns that they saw in that wood. The difference in what was depicted to the true materiality of the coffin demonstrates the desire to elevate the object into the elite sphere by imitating this high-quality prestige material. They were able to use art to ensure that the coffin owners would benefit from the same religious protection and transformative magic afforded to the upper elite through cedar. Now, whether these individuals knew that what they were depicting was Cedrus labani specifically is unclear. They may simply have been imitating the imported timbers seen on elite coffins, though, as the vast majority of elite wooden coffins were made of cedar, this was almost certainly what they were indeed copying. Moreover, references to the elite status of cedar are so frequent that it is unlikely that somebody would know the significance of imported timber for coffins and be unaware of the significance of Lebanese cedar wood. So to conclude this snapshot, I've reviewed 3 forms of coffin construction and decoration. The first is the high elite cedar coffins, where the use of cedar was emphasized, either by leaving the wood exposed or adding a very light wash of red or yellow color. The second was the use of thin strips of cedar veneer over a local wood core when access to large amounts of cedar was limited. Finally was the use of art to create a local wood skeuomorph of a cedar coffin. Now, although these individuals, whether the owners or craftspeople, could not gain access to the cedar wood itself, they demonstrate their knowledge of an elite material vocabulary, and through the power of Egyptian imagery, are able to borrow the power and prestige of cedar coffins to help transport the coffin owner safely to the afterlife. These practices therefore reflect the hierarchy of their owners, with the highest elite sporting the full cedar coffins and the lowest elite the skeuomorphs. It also demonstrates the ability of the carpenters to adapt their patrons' desires and means, as well as their own knowledge of the value of different timbers. Indeed, as the ones working directly with the wood, their knowledge would have no doubt contributed to its high value as well. This also helps to demonstrate the power and use of art in ancient Egypt to gain access to potent, prestigious materials that were controlled by society's wealthiest individuals. All of this combines to show that the Egyptians were very much conscious of their selection of timber. They not only desired high-quality timbers, but they wanted a specific high-quality timber. Wood is too frequently overlooked in a discussion of the hierarchies of materials in ancient Egypt, but it is clear that wood was important, and cedar was the most important wood. This is important to stress, for while Egyptologists are pretty quick to say that a gold worker must have been a trusted, valued, high-ranking craftsman in the ancient world, they are not as quick to say the same about woodworkers. Understanding that wood, and specifically cedar, was so important helps us to understand that those who worked this wood were likely very important too. So we've seen 2 snapshots here. One was selected to demonstrate that understanding specific construction joining choices might reveal things about Egyptian society. It suggests that the history of coffin construction traditions has a very different trajectory than the political history of Egypt. It shows communities that were resilient to the apparent social collapse, adapting to new clientele but maintaining their practices. Traditions are clearly passed down for a century during a time when no craftsmanship was supposed to be occurring, and then carry on for generations once the political situation stabilized. Again, once a standard means of coffin construction emerged, it remained intact for almost 700 years. From our second snapshot, cedar skeuomorphs, we better understand just how valuable cedar timber was. It had to be valued for reasons beyond its physical qualities, as it was imported in much, much higher quantities than other species of high-quality softwoods. It was so admired that the lower elite mimicked the designs on their local wood coffins, just to share in that elite vocabulary of display. Also, these values are at play during the first intermediate period, even when cedar was supposedly impossible to obtain, perhaps once again suggesting less of a breakdown in traditional views and beliefs than the elite literature would have us believe. These 2 snapshots into coffin construction reveal an alternative history of ancient Egypt, one written from the perspective of non-royal carpenters and craftspeople who had different priorities and concerns than the kings and conquerors that fill our history books. And as we piece together more snapshots, more of the knowledge, traditions, and lives of these individuals will become visible. So with that, thank you very much for listening to me. The quick thank you to the incredible staff at the Museo Egizio in Turin, where the vast majority of the coffins I talked about today are held, and for the travel support for these projects that came from STM College and USask itself. And I'd be